All right, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. We are live. It is Friday night. It is Big Dave's Healthy Happy Hour. So thanks for tuning in. While people get settled and get started here, let me make a couple of quick announcements. Hopefully this is now working. Okay, I see a couple of people tuning in now. Good. All right. So thanks for being here, everybody. I know it's Friday night. Everybody's ready to kick back, relax, and we will do some relaxing tonight. We're going to have a lot of fun. Quick announcements before we start. Number one, next week we're off. We will have no broadcast, but be sure to subscribe to my channel or like my Facebook page so that you get updates for the next Healthy Happy Hour when it does happen. So that's number one. So let's get started. Tonight, I have a very special guest, our first repeat guest. I know it's only been like 6 episodes and you're like, holy crap, this guy's repeating himself already. But we had so much fun last time and such a great response. I asked him back, Dr. Steven Schrantz. He's an immunologist from University of Chicago. And as I said last time, he's a real doctor, one that helps people, as my mother would say, not like my brother Greg. So we're going to ask him all kinds of questions about immunology, the big topic of the moment, COVID. But it's a little bit of an odd podcast tonight because we're also going to do, we're going to start out with something of a homage to a teacher and professor of mine, Gerald Callahan, who was also an immunologist. So I'll talk about all that and the connection in just a second. Especially because he's a doctor, I want to remember to say this off the top. Anything you hear tonight is not medical advice. Be sure to speak to your own doctor or nurse or shaman or health professional before implementing any diet or lifestyle changes. Now, without further ado or falderall, please help me in welcoming Dr. Steven Schrantz.
Hi, everybody.
Welcome, Steve.
How are you?
Great. Good seeing you again, man.
Absolutely.
All right. And folks who are tuning in, let's make this definitely a two-way conversation. So throw in some comments, tell us hello, where you're from, where you're tuning in from, and ask any questions along the way. So thanks for being here again. As I explained last time, Steve, you and I know each other from way back in college. We went our different paths and gave our friendship a 25-year hiatus of sorts.
Right. We reconnected on Zoom like so many people in the COVID pandemic. I just had another Zoom reunion with some of my residency pals this past weekend. And
that's awesome.
And I was telling them, I'm like, I'm doing another Facebook Live with my friend Dave, who we reconnected on Zoom back in the spring. So it's funny how that's all happened now.
Yeah, no, it's great. And it's great that Zoom can be used for good purposes and not just endless meetings and misery. But the reason I asked you back was something very specific. I mentioned that as I was writing this book, I'll tell the story real quick for everybody. As I was writing this book, I had gone through a process of research, of lots of reading, lots of just collecting materials, lots of interviewing people, from people with epilepsy, doctors, patients, researchers. This is for my book, by the way, My Unremarkable Brain. And I got to the point where I couldn't figure out how to write it. Because I kept hitting this stumbling block of, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a fitness coach, I'm not a guru. What do I have to say about diet, health, exercise, or epilepsy, or any of it? But I did know that I wanted to kind of combine some of my own experience with what I had learned and sort of tell that story. And so, what ended up coming out is a book that's a little bit of a hodgepodge, but I think of it as a journey of learning. But the idea struck me as I was grappling with this problem. The idea struck me, and I remembered an author that I read and actually was one of my professors back in graduate school, Professor Gerald Callahan. And I thought, that's right. He wrote that book. It was something about immunity, and he taught us a lot about creative science writing. And as I started mining the memories, I started going back there in my mind. And it was a great class. It was actually team taught. So Jerry Callahan, very interesting guy. He was a PhD in immunology, but he also had a dual appointment in the English department. So, very odd combination, but that was his bailiwick. I mean, creative science writing. And so I picked up his book again, and he team taught the class with another professor, named David Mogan. And we read science fiction, we read essays about science, and we read poetry about science. And so, it was really insightful about how science can be blended with these different genres and literature. And, the more I went back to my notes and back to my thinking about it, it really kind of lit the way forward for my essay. So as I started, I grabbed his book again and started rereading it. And he's such a brilliant guy, not comparing myself to him at all. I mean, amazing professor, and amazingly knowledgeable guy. But I got about 2 weeks in, and I read on Facebook that he had passed away the week before. And so it's just this really weird and sort of sad coincidence that this happened at the same time. And so in my acknowledgments, I actually thank him among my other professors for his influence on me. But when I started this whole thing, and when we reconnected, the ideas kind of connected in my brain. I said, wow, wouldn't it be cool if we could do this event where Steve and I could kind of look at some of Jerry's writing and talk about it, just like Jerry and David used to do the same thing in front of the class. My buddy Marty, who was in the class, used to say, it's kind of like watching two guys fishing. The two of them are just sitting there telling their stories, telling their jokes. And they had taught the class like 10 times by then, probably. So they had their whole routine down. So Steve was generous enough to agree to come on, and would love to talk about one of the essays from this book, one of his most famous essays. For folks who don't know anything about him, I'll just and there's a quick picture from this was posted in his obituary, and I'll just read. It's actually a really beautiful obituary. I'll read a quick section from that to just give you the idea of who he was. He passed away on August 6th. It says, on August 6th, Gerald Neil Callahan, quote, purposely peeled his fingers loose from the grasses and the hollow stones and fell into the stars. He was 73. That was a quote from one of his piece of his work. So Jerry Callahan was a Renaissance man, a loving family man, award-winning writer and poet, gifted immunologist, inspirational teacher, insightful mentor, fierce friend. He had a limitless capacity for expansive thought and the ability to combine his love of science and creative writing into philosophy. He wrote at the intersection of memoir and science to explore the personal meaning of modern biomedical research. He believed the stories we tell are infectious agents with the power to heal or destroy. And I love that last line, just that stories are these infectious agents. They're shared from person to person, and they get into us in these ways, maybe even change who we are. So kind of as a frame, and then something else happened this week. I read an article that really intrigued me, and I'm not sure what I think of it, but there's a professor, it was an article in Nautilus magazine. Steve, are you familiar with Nautilus online science magazine?
No, I'm not familiar with this.
It's an interesting little magazine, and I think it's only online, and they always have some sort of intriguing things. But this was an interview with a professor, and the professor is named Angus Fletcher. He'd written a new book called Wonderworks, and the thesis of that book is that we need to read literature like scientists. That literature is taught the wrong way in high schools and colleges. We're always inspired by what's known as the new criticism movement, which came from the early 20th century. We're always looking for the deeper meaning. We're talking about what the author intended, but he says, if we look at it, any story, any work of literature is sort of a solution to a problem. Let me see the quote that I have from him. He says, literature is, quote, a machine designed to work in concert with another machine, our brain. The purpose of the two machines is to accelerate each other. Literature is a way of accelerating human imagination. Literature is very effective at generating a sense of wonder, which is the most basic and primordial spiritual sense. And that quote, maybe because it's top of mind, but that quote to me really connects with this piece that we're going to talk about, chimera, where, we often, there's actually in that class, I was first introduced to the word sense of wonder, which is sort of a jaded term thrown around in science fiction about how, science fiction can create this sort of sense of wonder about the universe and about what it is. But what Callahan does in this essay really creates, I think, a sense of wonder about ourselves, right? About the human body. Did you get that sense from it?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I mean, I think this essay definitely, it's just a fantastic metaphor for how we interact with the world and the people around us and that we care deeply about.
Yeah. And so I thought, let's just jump through. I annotated my Kindle version because I didn't want to write in my book. I don't know. I'm just like that. But let's start with the title itself, Chimera. So Chimera, if you look it up like I did, means a couple of things. So the way it's used, the way it was originally used in Greek mythology, it was a creature with like the head of a lion and a tail of a dragon, something like that. But it's used popularly as a vision or a phantom or something that's not there, right? And it's also used in the science literature, and I gotta read this. In science, a chimera is essentially a single-cell organism that's made up of cells from one or two more individuals. That is, it contains two sets of DNA with the code to make two separate organisms. So that title to me is so apt because it really is what's going on in the essay itself, So just to give sort of a background, I'll give sort of the Reader's Digest version, I guess, of the essay here. It starts with a story of him seeing his wife his ex-wife at a coffee shop, I guess former wife, I should say. And however, she's been dead 10 years. And so he knows that it's not really her, but he sort of puzzles over this idea that for a minute he could swear that he saw her ordering a latte. And I'll just read that quote, from a literary standpoint. I mean, it's just a beautiful passage. Last Thursday, one of those gray fall days when starlings gather up and string between the elms around here, my first wife, my children's mother, dead 10 years, walked into a pastry shop where I was buttering a croissant. She ignored me, which she always does, ordered a plain bagel and an almond latte, picked up her food, and without a glance at me, walked out. The starlings chittered, the day frowned, and I went back to buttering my croissant. So it's kind of a striking opening, right? It sort of makes you do a little bit of a double take. And you sort of say, what's going on here? And that's why I read that quote, because I think what this essay does is it poses this sort of problem almost, like these two opposite things. His wife is dead 10 years, but he also sees her. And how can science and literature kind of help us solve that? And then he goes all the way, and I'll just, again, briefly, he goes all the way into this idea of his grandmother used to save things in mason jars. that leads them into a discussion of immunological memory, enveloped viruses, phantom limbs, and then kind of brings it all together with this idea of phantom memory, right? So if we kind of break up the book into parts, that's what's kind of going on there, right? So let me start. Well, is there anything that struck you specifically, Steve, when you read this?
No, I mean, I think there were many things. I mean, as we kind of talked about, I mean, the first thing that it was touching to read an idea like this, that this idea that everybody we encounter in the world somehow leaves part of themselves with us.
Mm-hmm.
And it was that physical presence of his former wife in him that allowed him to see her in that sense. And the way he talks about it, and that he could, just literally smell the almond latte that she was ordering and that sort of thing, I thought was, it's a very touching metaphor. But when he goes through the science parts of it, I mean, it's very, it's right on. I mean, the way our body, it's set up to set up these immune cells that memorize the structures of all these different viruses and proteins and things around us to recognize the self versus the non-self, right? And allow us to protect ourselves and defend ourselves against that non-self entity. So it's and the way he kind of took that metaphor and ran with it, I thought was really creative. And clearly the man was able to build a career around that sort of mind, which is fantastic. So that was my initial impression, was just, the guy who clearly had the science right, understood it, but could put it in such a way that was artfully marrying two kind of what seems to be disparate concepts. But I think that's the beautiful thing about medicine for me in many ways, and I had the privilege of practicing it, is to be able to take that application of science and apply it to humanity, and really to marry those two concepts, recognizing that we're not all just, physical beings walking around on this planet, that there is this metaphysical side to our being as well, and that paying attention to that. Two things. One, it makes my job a heck of a lot more interesting. Yeah. And the second thing is that I do think it makes me a better, healer and caregiver. Yeah. So, but, it's interesting. Today, I had an interaction with a family, pediatric case, and medically it was pretty boring and nothing special. And frankly, I was asking myself, why did we even bother to help with this case? Because the answer was so plainly obvious. And as the fellow is going through all the science with the family and just explaining why we don't have to be there, at the end of it all, I stopped it and I said, but you forgot the most important question, Dave. And the poor fellow looks at me like, oh my God, what? I totally dropped the ball. And I said, and I asked the patient, she's 16 years old, and I'm like, so are you an outside hitter or a setter? She's wearing this volleyball T-shirt. Her mom's got a volleyball jacket on. Nice. It's clear that, that was the only thing that she cared about at that time. So my point is that, how science and humanity can, join together to really make this fantastic connection between all of us. And when you see those connections, and clearly he did through all these things, that's where I think the joy and the magic of all this comes together, is when you can start to make these connections in your life between the things that don't seem to be connected. And when you start to see those connections, it really makes life more enjoyable and more interesting. Yeah. So well said. I mean, I remember, when I first heard the term humanities was, sometime in high school. And, the teacher said, well, humanities are those disciplines that try to understand, as opposed to the hard sciences, what he said. The hard sciences, you're trying to understand things, where humanities, you're trying to understand what it is to be human. And that's always sort of
as a person who works, as an English professor and someone who works in the humanities, I've always kind of carried that. But this book really made me realize that no, they're both about what it is to be human. We're all just trying to understand that.
Right. And it's in some ways it's looking at it through a different lens. And I think what this guy was so good at was his lens was the same lens for everything, but it was able to illustrate the connections where many lenses wouldn't see the connections. And so that was, I think, his contribution, at least from what I read. I want to read the rest of his book, but unfortunately, things like COVID-19 make it a little bit harder to find time to read for pleasure these days.
Yeah, I mean, you're busy saving the world, so we'll give you a pass.
Oh, I wouldn't go that far. There's a big world out there, and COVID-19 just seems to be pulling all the oxygen from everything at this time. But I have been more optimistic this past week than I've been in a long time. I kind of feel like we're starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel. I feel like there is some significant rays of hope that are shining through. So
that's great. Well, we can talk more about that. And thanks, folks. Be sure to enter to add your COVID related questions. I did have a couple of things in the essay that I'm still fuzzy on that I was hoping you could help me understand. He talks about enveloped viruses. Am I saying that right?
Yeah, enveloped viruses, right?
Enveloped viruses. Yeah. Okay. English.
Okay.
So, and I love his, he says, enveloped viruses, and he mentions flu, cold sores, AIDS. Each time we give the flu to our wives or cold sores to our husbands, we also give them a little bit of ourselves. How does that? Can you give us that from a scientific standpoint?
Well, I think a little bit is DNA. I mean, it's a tiny bit. So essentially, viruses use our bodies as factories to make more of themselves. And the way the machinery works is, and it depends on the virus, but many of these viruses will at some point integrate into our own genetic code. And specifically, he mentions the retroviruses, which are the ones that are most likely to do that. Okay. And the best known retrovirus at this time is HIV.
Right.
And what's interesting is HIV and coronavirus have many similar structures, but HIV has some very unique characteristics that coronavirus doesn't have. And specifically, that's this ability to take its RNA. Many of the listeners probably have heard things like mRNA now because of the vaccines using mRNA. Right. So they're both single-stranded RNA viruses, but what HIV does that coronavirus can't do is it has an enzyme encoded in it that allows it to turn its RNA into DNA. And then that DNA integrates into your own DNA. And this is why we can't just kill HIV, is because it literally integrates into your own cells.
Wow.
And so without killing the host, there's no way to figure out how to pull it out of you and to kill it. So the way we manage HIV now is essentially we recognize it's going to be there. We can't get rid of it, but we can prevent it from making more of itself by selectively inhibiting the enzymes we know it needs to make more of itself.
Oh, wow. So that's the treatment. I was wondering about that because I know that's where you've spent most of your career on AIDS, right? HIV.
But there's a lot of similarities between all these viruses. And I think what the author was getting at is these viruses use our cells to make more of themselves. And as they do, sometimes they're going to pull a chunk of our genetic code with that virus that will pass on. So viruses are constantly evolving and changing in that way. And it's actually been theorized that this has been part of human evolution. That part of the reason we've been able to evolve over time is we're all sharing genetic material between ourselves with viruses and probably not knowing that we're doing so. There's a lot of research going on right now. You probably heard of the microbiome. Yeah. Right. And that's what's all the bacteria in our gut. Well, there's also this thing called the virome. And we all have these viruses in our gut as well that help bacteria share material to one another. And there's probably viruses, most likely there are, that we are all spreading and that don't cause an infection that we get sick from, but are sharing genetic material all the way.
Wow. Yeah, that's crazy. That's crazy to think about.
So evolution's happening on a micro scale as we are all just interacting with each other in some way.
Yeah. That's wild. That's
right.
wild. Because we always, and this I think is one of the big themes of the book, right? What is the self and what is other? The immune system protects us, and he says makes us human because it protects the self from invaders that are coming in, right? But is there at the end of the day, when I think the number that he gives at one point in the book is 50 to 90% of the cells in our body are bacteria, are not even us, right? Yeah. And so what is us really, right?
Right.
I mean, is this my hand? How much of it is actually my hand, and how much of it is little critters flying around inside there or something, right?
Right. And we were joking about this before we started the webcast. Is this past week, for those of us who are into science fiction and movies and such, there was this show that was on Disney Plus called WandaVision. And the last scene of that movie, they talk about the ship of Theseus.
Yeah.
This idea of if the ship of Theseus is this mind experiment that was proposed by Greek philosophers back in the day, where if you take this ship, and as the ship rots, every time a plank of wood rots, you replace it with a new one. Mm-hmm. And over time, you're left with just a new ship. Is that the ship of Theseus or not? Right? And so in some ways, that's kind of how the human body is in many ways. We're constantly evolving and changing such that what we started with isn't what we end with, but is it still the continuity? Is that still the same self?
Right.
So anyway, that's one of the thoughts I had as I was reading this book or this essay, because I was like, I've seen WandaVision. But anyway, it's super interesting to think about that sort of mind experiment and what it, are all those E. coli in my intestines me, or are they just living with me, or anyway, because we're all sharing the same genetic material back and forth.
Yeah, it's incredible. That's incredible. Really.
Right.
So to kind of bring to close this part of that segment, I think this late quote from late in the essay kind of brings that idea. And like you say, it's the idea of the immune system and the retrovirus being a metaphor for how our emotional lives are affected by others, particularly in a long-term relationship, right?
Right.
He says, pieces of ourselves might be lifted and replaced by whole chunks of another. Husband and wife begin to speak alike, know what the other is thinking, anticipate what the other will say, begin even to look alike, until one day, what remains is truly and thoroughly a mosaic, a chimera, part man, part woman, part someone else. And it's just beautiful to me, Right. I mean, it's a beautiful meditation on what a relationship is in a certain way, right?
For sure. And that's in many respects, that's what it's all about on this planet, right? It's the relationships we make with obviously significant others, but everybody in some ways, right? And constantly in a community and on a macro sense, but also on that micro sense as well.
Yeah,
that's where I thought his work was really insightful.
Yeah. Well, thank you for humoring me on that.
No problem.
And let me just close out by saying, Jerry, thank you for your work you've done, and wherever you are now, your work, your ideas live on in our DNA, your readers and your students, and you've affected all of our lives. So thank you, and we miss you. Awesome. So let's jump over to we've got folks in from Old Town Alexandria, from Chicagoland. My mom is tuning in. Bill and Jane from Alexandria as well. we've got our first question, but yeah, folks, don't be shy. Throw in some more questions here. John Robinson, who I know is not actually, even though my father is named John Robinson, this is a different John Robinson. Hey, John. He says, Dr. Schrantz, really appreciate you summarizing your readings on inflammation's role in COVID severity. Have you read any interesting developments since the last call, which was just a couple of weeks ago? But we can revisit that because I think we have a whole new audience tonight too. So
yeah, one of the fascinating things about this disease is how it involves the inflammatory cascade, and how there's a diagram that I saw early on that people were using to describe how this happens. But essentially, you reach about a week into illness, 7 to 10 day mark, and there's a fork in the road. And some people just go on and get better and everything's fine. And other people then go into this inflammatory cascade where the body doesn't seem to pull back and recognize that it's got this and it can take care of it. It kind of starts to feed on itself where things continue to get worse. And it's not entirely clear why that happens or what the underlying mechanism is for that to happen. There's a lot of different descriptions of this. And what's the principle underpinning from a biochemical point of view is not clear. But what we recognize is that's eventually what ends up killing people, is this inflammatory cascade, because that inflammatory cascade can then lead to clots forming. And as clots begin to form, those are bad things, right? If you think about your plumbing in your house, if you got something blocking the pipes, it don't work so well.
Right.
And the same thing in the body. If all of a sudden you've got something blocking the pipes, that's when you end up with strokes. You end up with pulmonary emboli. So many of the times that people have the problems in their lungs, it's not so much that they're having trouble getting air into their lungs, which is the cause of most pneumonias, where you've got mucus and that sort of thing in your airways that's blocking oxygen to getting in the blood. It's actually the opposite, where we're developing all these micro clots in the blood vessels that's preventing blood to getting to the air.
Wow. That sounds scary.
Right. So that's kind of, and then, so you take that and extrapolate it out. And so you've got all these clots that are forming throughout the body. And that's actually what ends up killing people with COVID.
Wow.
So that's been an interesting phenomenon to watch and try to understand, why is this happening? And a lot of it has to do with the cascade of events as how the virus interacts with different receptors on the cell surface. And I think as we continue to explore this over the next, several generations of researchers to try to understand these things, that'll be the interesting thing that really comes out of it. In terms of things that have happened over the last 2 weeks that are interesting, along this thought, one of the drugs that was proposed very early on for the treatment of COVID-19 was this drug called Tosalisimab, or Actemra. And it's a very specific inhibitor of a certain inflammatory molecule known as, my mind is just blanking on which one it blocks. It's a, anyway, so
we'll back to it.
I'll come back to it. I apologize.
It'll come to you.
Blocks a very specific inflammatory molecule, and it's IL-6. Thank you. Sorry.
There it is.
So, and interleukin 6 is what it blocks, and it was developed actually for rheumatic diseases to help in those conditions. But we realized that it blocks in this inflammatory cascade. Well, then, so early on, we're like, oh, this seems to work. In China, they tried it. It seemed to work. But the data was a little cloudy and murky at first. And so we tried it, and it seemed to be doing okay. And then it went through a period of time where everybody was worried that it might be increasing secondary infections. So like it was reducing the immune system too much. And so they'd end up with a bacterial process in their lungs or something. So it kind of fell out of disfavor for a while. Yeah. And then there was a study published in May out of the UK looking at dexamethasone. Many of us have probably heard about this in the lay press. And so that's a steroid. And that also it's kind of like a main switch on the immune system. It doesn't specifically target one molecule. It just, the whole thing dials it down.
Whole deal. Yeah.
And that seemed to work well.
Okay.
And everybody just switched and said, we'll just use dexamethasone. Well, then over the last few weeks, what came out was that Tosalisimab, in addition to that, actually helps.
Okay.
So there is something about IL-6 and how the inflammatory cascade continues through this process that somehow Tosalisimab probably does help a little bit more than originally thought. But again, from my mind, what's interesting about it is how science has wrestled with this and how it was like, hey, this seems to have promise. Let's start doing it. And they did it. And then they're like, whoa, wait a minute. Maybe it doesn't work. And, oh, maybe it does work again. And
kind
of back and forth. And so you kind of get this whiplash sense of the literature. So, one of the other things that came up this past week, speaking of whiplash, is I've done a fair amount of work with convalescent plasma. And early on, this idea of convalescent plasma makes a lot of sense, right? We've used it in other epidemics. This idea that antibodies are what help to prevent viruses from doing their thing. And so if we could just pull the antibodies out of somebody who's already made them and use them in somebody else, it will prevent the virus from getting worse. Makes perfect sense. We started doing it. But then it was a question of like, well, which antibody is the one that's really doing the job, and trying to figure that out. And then, so as we went through all that, that's what then led to the development of the monoclonal antibodies that, people have gotten a lot of press about. Eli Lilly has one, Regeneron, the one that saved the president's life, that's that one. So all of that was based on this idea that antibodies do something. Well, then even some of those have been questionable and not great. And then other studies have shown, no, it really does work. So we literally saw this past couple weeks, one paper that came out that said that Eli Lilly's new combo, prevents 90% of hospitalizations. But at the same time, there was an article that came out that said convalescent plasma is worthless, so don't even bother.
Wow.
So it's like,
all right, trying
to wrestle all this and figure out what's real, what's not, how the studies were done. It's super confusing and challenging. So
particularly for you, you're a doctor at the front lines, right? You're trying to help these people and do what the science says works, but the science is still being written in a certain way, right? There's consensus, just doesn't exist in certain ways.
Well, consensus is continually evolving, and I think this is where many people really struggle with this. Especially physicians, but also people who are in the lay community are trying to understand this too, right? And I think that was part of the I don't want to say backlash or misunderstanding, but remember early on in the epidemic, people were like, you don't need to wear masks. Matter of fact, don't go get a mask, because if you get a mask, you're taking it away from somebody who really needs the mask.
Right. I remember that. Yeah.
Right. And then like 30 days later, we totally U-turned on that. Like, everybody needs to wear a mask.
Yeah.
And a lot of that was just the evolution of thought.
Yeah.
In real time. And it was this idea that, well, the mask isn't to protect you, it's to protect other people from you. Right. Boom. Like all of a sudden that changed everybody's mindset. And it was like, wait a minute, what? I don't understand what's going on. Right. And that's continued to be the problem as people have tried to think about what masks are. And you see people saying, people shouldn't tell me to wear a mask. I'm going to do whatever I want. It's my life. It's my health. Right. But the truth is that the mask is what's potentially protecting other people. Right.
Exactly.
Right. But that mindset was set early, and it has been challenging to change.
Yeah.
And so
I like to say that, I don't necessarily need to wear a shirt when I go to the supermarket in order to keep from getting sunburned, but it's a good idea. And the other customers really appreciate it. So, it's
early on in the epidemic, I gave an interview to a radio program here. It's on at like 6 a.m, but the radio program's talking about, it's all about golf. And the guy wanted to talk about golf and COVID, because that was like one of the only things people were allowed to do back in April.
I remember.
Golf, right. And I said, the thing about masks is it's like golf etiquette, right? So when you're learning to play the game of golf, you have to learn that there are certain rules or certain things you're not allowed to do. And it's not because it's, changing. It's just being polite to somebody else, right? You're not allowed to talk in somebody's backswing. You're not allowed to stand in their, or put your shadow on their ball, those sort of things.
Right.
You just have to be, you're basically recognizing that your presence is affecting somebody else's performance.
Yeah.
So, and it's the same thing with masking, right? You're recognizing that you potentially could be carrying the virus. You don't know. So you wear a mask to say, I'm taking care of you.
Yeah. Yeah. That's
and
right.
that concept for many people was just, and it still is, unfortunately, challenging to recognize.
Yeah. Yeah. That's, well, that's a really interesting point too. I don't know if there's any research on this or if it's even possible to do research on this, but is there any sense of, for every person who develops the symptoms of the disease, there's going to be, as far as I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, but there are some people who have the disease, go through it and fight it off and never develop any symptoms, right?
That's right.
And so is there any sense of the proportion there? I mean,
so one stat I've seen is that up to 40% of new infections are caused by somebody who is asymptomatic.
wow. That's where I was going with it. Yeah.
Right. So that's one stat I've read. I can't quote it and give you a site for it right now.
Yeah,
but
no, that's fine. That's fine.
but that is something I have read. So there's and that's part of the reason why the public health officials have said that the number of people infected is probably 10 times the number we actually have. And then that has led other people to say, well, if that's true, then we're probably closer to herd immunity. And we've talked about what herd immunity was last time.
Right. That's
we're
right.
probably closer to that than we recognize.
Yeah.
There's been people that have said, well, that's probably the reason we're seeing such a steep decline in disease over the last month. And hard to know for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Because it's not because people are social distancing. I mean, the restaurants here are getting more and more packed every day. Right.
Right.
So there's something going on. Yeah. Yeah. That's really interesting.
I'd like to think it's all the vaccines that are rolling out, but at this point, 10%
but that contributes to the herd immunity effect too, right?
It's going to help for sure.
Yeah, that's wild. That's excellent. I want to jump back to one technical thing you mentioned, IL-6. And it only rings a bell because just the other day I was listening to a podcast with, it was a health, low carb podcast, and they were talking about the I'm going to butcher this, but I think it was visceral fat specifically seems to have an effect on the body's levels of IL-6. That fat kind of works as an organ almost in some ways because it changes our hormone structure and things like our milieu. So just thinking, is that a possible explanation why we see obesity, diabetes, some of these comorbidities being associated with worse outcomes for COVID?
For sure. So, obesity has kind of been linked to this almost an inflammatory state in itself, right? Mm-hmm. So being, that's extremely overweight is probably creating more and more inflammatory mechanisms than we recognize. And it could be because the adipose cells are somehow contributing to those inflammatory mediators as well. That it's not clear at this time, but there's a clear link between there's been many terms for like the metabolic syndrome or obesity and diabetes, and all these things are intrinsically linked. And one of the reasons we've seen such an increase in death rate in the United States is because metabolic syndrome, obesity, these are significant conditions throughout the population of Americans. And so many people have postulated that part of the reason why we're having such a bad epidemic in the United States is because of our lifestyles and our health. The other thing I'll say about, just weight in general is the patients I saw early on that died from this infection, most of them were exceedingly obese. Okay. And part of that is just mechanics. Imagine, if you've only got 20% of your lungs that are working and you're trying to lift that kind of weight off your chest, from your obesity, you're just going to get tired faster and it's harder to stay healthy in that situation. So,
never thought about that. Yeah.
It's multiple things, but I do think that there's some link between, COVID, its inflammatory cascade, and obesity. are definitely all going to be linked.
Yeah.
And I think over time, researchers will be able to draw those what seem to be dotted lines now into nice solid connections.
Yeah, that's interesting. That is really interesting. So, and I know folks are and you said you're feeling a little more optimistic than you were a few months ago. As far as, let's talk vaccines a little more, because I think it's on everybody's brain.
Yeah.
I heard today. Well, let me start with this. I heard today, and I actually also saw on Twitter sort of a gotcha video. It was an interview with Dr. Fauci, challenging him on the fact that the FDA has authorized the vaccine with emergency authorization, but not full authorization, and sort of why is that, and does it mean that the vaccine is unsafe? So if you have any insights on any of that.
So I've never worked at the FDA, so disclaimer there. So what goes on and how those deliberations and those policies are discovered or decided upon is not entirely clear to me. But my understanding is that they use with this emergency use authorization is based on just. And they've rarely used this in the past. And I think it has to do just with the speed at which they're getting to these decisions to authorize the use of something. Right. Usually there's just a time to allow things to move. But that being said, the amount of data we were able to acquire in such a short period of time has really not been seen in any other disease. Even if you think about HIV, for example, right? And there was a lot of criticism back in the day about how slow the FDA was to get treatments up and running for HIV. Just the scale of that disease compared to coronavirus was, so much less. I mean, we think about HIV today and we go, oh my God, it seems to be everywhere. There's 30 million people infected, right? Wow. Worldwide. But compare that to coronavirus, right? I mean, it's the scale at which coronavirus is infecting the world is so much greater. I mean, if you look at the numbers that were in the trials, so for example, the Moderna trial had 30,000 people. The Pfizer trial had 40,000 people. The Johnson & Johnson trial had 44,000 people. That's a lot of data.
Yeah.
So once you're able to get it quickly, right? Because the HIV takes years for you to get sick from it. Whereas coronavirus, most people, it's a week-long incubation, another 2 weeks of illness, and then you're better. So the time frame is just from the disease is that much more compressed. And so that allows us to acquire so much more data so much more quickly. And we're in a phase now where we actually have systems that can process that data quickly. We have, networks in place to do the research that can figure these things out much faster. So all those things, I think, allowed us to get to the answer of, are these vaccines safe and effective faster than things we were able to do in the past?
Right.
And this term emergency use authorization, my sense of that is that it's kind of a historic term that hasn't caught up with what's happening in reality.
Right. No, that makes total sense. I heard one podcast I heard was doctor, I think it was of public health, was talking about this. The longest period of any vaccine trial is just getting volunteers, trying to get enough people to sign up and to take something that is experimental and see if it works. Whereas this was, people were sort of jumping at the chance to become involved, and so that's why it kind of went so quickly.
Yep.
And thank you for your work in helping develop those, from what I understand, right?
Yeah, I was a co-investigator at our site for two of the studies, the Moderna vaccine and Johnson & Johnson, and we're trying to get some pediatric trials up and going now as well. So
great, and that brings us perfectly into our questions from Powie and Tim. Both ask about the differences between these vaccines.
So the major difference between the vaccines, they're all basically mechanisms for delivering the body the spike protein of the coronavirus, right? The spike protein is basically the key to the lock on our cells, right? And so that's what the virus uses to get into our cells to make more of itself. And so by identifying that spike protein, what we've realized is that our body's going to make antibodies and develop, memory cells, back to our earlier discussion, that will allow us to protect ourselves against that entity. And so these vaccines are all designed to introduce our body to that spike protein. The three that we have licensed in the United States right now are the 2 mRNA vaccines, the Pfizer, the Moderna, and then the new one, the adenovirus vectored DNA recombinant Johnson & Johnson vaccine. But essentially, the concept is the same. How do we get the body to see the spike protein so it can make antibodies? And so the major differences between, there's probably really no difference between the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines on a macro level. Somebody described it once as some people like Coke in a can and some people like Coke in a bottle.
Okay.
Right. That's basically the Moderna Pfizer.
Yeah.
And that's why, they're very, very similar.
I love it.
The Johnson & Johnson one is it's definitely different. It's a totally different delivery mechanism where we're
using RC Cola.
Right. It's probably closer to Pepsi, maybe Dr. Pepper.
All right.
Yeah, to run that metaphor to the ground. But the idea of that one is that it uses an adenovirus that can't replicate in our bodies and cause its own infection to introduce that genetic material into our cells so that it makes the spike protein, and then our bodies can then make the immune response to the spike protein. So from a logistical difference, the Johnson & Johnson was studied as a one shot, at least in the initial study. There's an ongoing study right now looking at what would 2 shots do for us.
Okay.
And so that's ongoing. And my guess is that you would see a boosting response with the second shot, which is frankly the same thing we saw with the Pfizer and the Moderna study. If you go back and look at the data for the Pfizer and the Moderna study, both of them gave you a pretty good immune response with 1 shot.
Oh, okay.
50 and 70%.
Yeah, we don't hear a lot about that.
Right.
We hear that, you need the 2. Everybody knows you need the second shot a month later, but there's
a lot of public health authorities that have been debating that.
Okay.
Maybe it's better to just give everybody 1 Pfizer or 1 Moderna shot and get those into as many people as possible as quickly as possible.
Interesting. So we get some benefit. You said 50 to 75. I cut you off.
Right. 50 to 70% with 1 shot.
Wow.
Is what some of the numbers have shown. The Pfizer study said specifically 52% is based on their calculations. So 1 shot of Pfizer does a pretty darn good job.
Wow.
And the Johnson & Johnson one, it's the converse. Maybe 2 shots would give us 95%. We just don't know that yet because we didn't study that yet.
And the first, because the number I heard was 60, I think 60%.
Right.
1 shot.
And even that number is an amalgamation of several different studies, right? So the Johnson & Johnson vaccine was studied in many different locales at a different time than the Moderna and the Pfizer. And if we've learned anything is that this coronavirus continues to evolve as we're treating it.
Right.
And we know that it's evolving differently in different places. So, for example, one of the places the Johnson & Johnson vaccine was studied was South Africa, where we know the South African variant was quite active at the time of the study.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was a little bit reduced, but it was still effective. It was 66% effective in South Africa.
Right. So it's possible that
mild and moderate disease, against hospitalization and death, all 3 are equal, 0. All 3 prevent death and hospitalizations.
Is that right?
Yeah. And if you go
Which is really the goal, more so than...
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's the whole idea. I mean, if you're going to get a little bit sick from it, fine. If you get a sniffle and, a couple of days, fine, right? Then it's the flu. Then it's the cold. Then it's what we've been dealing with all along. As long as you're not dying from it, we can get life back to normal. And that's the whole concept. And if you go back in time, and you said to somebody in April, I have a shot today that will say that you're not going to be hospitalized or get severely ill from this, you would take it in a heartbeat and not question it. But
give it to me now.
Right. And that's kind of what's happened over time is we've kind of moved the goalposts a little bit. Society's been like, well, we don't feel comfortable with this. And, and there are some reasons to be a little concerned. I mean, certainly we see, these long haulers, and there's a lot of concern about those sort of issues. And there does seem to be some, sequelae, if you will, to getting a COVID But the other thing was we don't even understand at this time how well the vaccines would prevent that. So we know that it prevents severe disease. We know it prevents hospitalizations and death. In those that had mild to moderate illness with the vaccine, how many of those people go on to develop quote unquote long hauler syndromes?
Right.
That's not known right now.
Right. Okay.
So, I mean, I think, the one thing I've been trying to promote here locally and been talking a lot about is just trying to get this idea that we just need to get vaccinated as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
As many people as fast as possible. And that way we'll hopefully have a normal summer.
Yeah, well, I would support that 100%. When you think about the downside of lockdowns, right? And I said this last time that we don't necessarily acknowledge this as well as we should. All the issues with psychological issues that people are facing, and being out of work, and just this whole slew of things that comes with lockdowns. If one shot, cuts the immunity of the people who get it a little bit. I mean, I could see a world in which, everyone's advised to get one, but if you have comorbidities, if you have particular, you're elderly, whatever, then you're advised to get two. No?
Yeah, no, I think there could be a lot of different permutations of this as we go forward.
Yeah.
I see some of the questions coming up in the comment section about we need to get a vaccine every year.
Yeah.
I think that's possible. I do think I could see a future honestly, where we get a respiratory virus shot every year. Okay. And that includes the flu, and it includes coronavirus. And eventually, maybe even rhinovirus, and all these other viruses that cause all these, upper respiratory infections.
Cold, the flu.
All possible. And you can imagine a world where we just say, okay, here are the circulating strains of these viruses. Here are the mRNA signals we need to prevent those. Put them all into one shot. Boom, you got your respiratory virus seasonal shot. I would say within 5 years, we're probably looking at something like that.
Wow, that is cool. I think you said last time that with this mRNA technology, it's actually possible to sort of it's easier to update than
right,
and develop new strains, right? Yeah.
Yeah, we're talking an order of days as compared to years, right? So you could just say, all right, here's the code for the current circulating strain, rejigger the mRNA, throw it into the machine, new vaccine.
Wow, that's amazing. That's right. Amazing. Because you do hear, right, that, you get the flu, the flu vaccine, you get pre-COVID, right? The annual flu vaccine, they're just guessing. They've had to develop it years ago based on what they thought would be the strains this year, but that won't be the case anymore.
Well, right. I think we'll be able to update it in a much more real-time fashion, right? Yeah. So the way the flu vaccine works now is we predict based on what's going on in Australia. Mm-hmm. And frankly, and we also use our military bases throughout the world to get a sense of what's going on in the southern hemisphere, which predicts what's going to happen in our winter.
Yeah, yeah. Okay.
And then, so we compile all that data and make our best guess, and then incubate a bunch of eggs in Pennsylvania, because that turns out where most of the egg farmers are. Chicken farmers are all in Pennsylvania. So if you're a chicken farmer, you might need to change your business model a little bit, because I think eventually we're not going to be needing those eggs as much as we have been in the past for incubating.
I had no idea that happened. That is wild.
There's a whole industry where that's all they do is they use those eggs to incubate for flu virus vaccines.
Oh my God. That's your fun fact of the day, folks.
Right.
Yeah.
So I can see a world where we're not going to need chicken farmers to do that. We're just going to need chicken farmers to give us eggs to eat. And that would, help you with your keto.
Exactly. I'll eat them. Send them to me.
But yeah, there's definitely, I think, a world for that to happen eventually.
Yeah. Wow. Before I let you go, do you have another minute or two?
Yeah.
Talk about reopening.
It's Friday night. I'm sitting here sharing a drink with my friend Dave online.
Nice. I love it, man. Because I know you also, I don't think we got a chance to talk about this much last time, but you advise school systems on reopening procedures, right? I got yelled at by my friend Ed because he asked a question last time and I didn't ask it to you properly, apparently. But it was about rowing and can we go rowing again? And you said, yeah, rowing is outdoors. If you're wearing masks, you're good. But let me get into specific. Let me get into a theoretical situation in which
hypothetical situation.
Yes, a hypothetical here. There's a sports league, the organization that oversees rowing in this area has decided there will be a season. The following precautions: masks on the rowers, and I believe on the coxswain as well, and a bubble effect where every boat, let's say an 8, right? So you got 8 rowers, 1 coxswain, 9 people. Those 9 people will have to row together every time. You won't be able to mix and match between the crews. And the coach will be part of the bubble as well. So a 10-person bubble. And this is their policy now that our local high schools have to do this. And the concern about having an adult rowing is that a bubble is unmanageable when you have people with jobs. And I have an early meeting this week, and so 7 other guys can't row. Those sorts of concerns. So maybe we can do single sculls, but maybe not. Any comments on the bubble? What's that?
You know how to scull now?
I've sculled in a quad. And an ocean single. Actually, I've got a good sculling story from back in Philadelphia. For those my podcast, so what the hell?
I do one oar with the sweep. I've never tried sculling, and I'm so right hand dominant that I'm pretty sure I just go in a circle.
It's you will at first.
Right.
You'll get very wet. When I was in Philadelphia, I did some rowing there, and with one of the clubs, and I would take out a single, one of the wider singles, so it's not an ocean shell, but it was sort of more stable, and it was a busy. The Schuylkill. It gets busy, and
we did it together back in the day.
Of course, yeah, head of the Schuylkill. But it's got these bridges and these curves through it, and it's actually tricky to navigate when you're going backwards. So I was going through, and I still contend that I was going through the correct span of the bridge. And all of a sudden, I just hear, wait off, and turn around just in time to see a high school girls 4, just coming at me, hard and trying to stop. Their bow came up over the front of my bow. And you know how the bow, if you remember the bow ball?
Yep.
Right, the little rubber ball on the front of the point?
Yep.
The bow ball got stuck somehow on the combing. So the bow kind of made its way through the bow ball. And when I looked down, it had gone over the combing, into the cockpit, and into my left butt cheek. And by about maybe half an inch. And so,
that can hurt.
Pulled it out, blood everywhere, luckily, and this goes back to your belly. What's that?
It's like a scene out of Ben-Hur.
Yeah, it was. That's really giving me way too much credit, but yes. So I get myself home, and luckily my roommate was a med student at the time, And so I said, well, we can take you down to the hospital. You'll probably, downtown Philly, you'll probably be in line behind the gunshot wounds and the stabbings and things like that. He's like, I could run in and get some sutures and put a couple of stitches in you. And I was like, all right, let's do it.
I'm ready to go.
Yeah, exactly. Grab a quick bourbon, put a tarp on top of the couch, and he sewed me up. So he and I were very close ever since. But anyway,
how did we end up on this tangent?
I don't know. I don't know. This is what happens. But bubbles. First of all, the idea of high school kids being in a bubble. Those girls could have used to be in a bubble. But anyway, yes.
I think the whole idea of bubbles is if one person ends up with COVID, then you're only taking down that bubble, right? But if you end up with, a mix and match kind of scenario and one person gets COVID, you've taken down the entire
team
organization.
Yeah.
That being said, I think that's going to be changing. I think over the next few months, there are going to be less and less needs to have bubbles. And as long as people are, properly wearing masks, distancing, and getting vaccinated, every time somebody gets vaccinated, that's one less person you have to worry about in that bubble.
Yeah.
So I think that's a precaution that's kind of a holdover from last summer, when the NBA bubble happened and the NHL had their bubble.
Right.
Those bubble ideas is going to slowly dissipate as we move into the summer months. And so my suspicion is that you'll be back growing, no problem, in a couple months.
Great. Yeah. Well, that's good news. So, thank you for that. So the bubble will pop, and
Bubble will pop.
we'll be able to get back out on the water. Because again, the obesity, and all these things that are bad for COVID, we should probably be exercising in some way.
Right. But remember this. You can never out-exercise a bad diet.
That is correct. I think I said that somewhere in my book too.
True.
Yes, I have learned that the hard way.
Yeah, me too. On a smaller scale, but me too.
Yeah. Well, I'll let you go. Let you enjoy your Friday night with your family. But thanks again, Steve, for being here. Appreciate it, man.
Yeah, really happy to help out, Dave, and I can't wait to see you again in person someday.
Yeah, no doubt. Someday we'll have a reunion, actual reunion.
Right. Yeah. So if you ever find yourself in Chicago, please do not hesitate to give me a call. I will drive to whatever part of the city you're in, and we will share whatever beverage you enjoy.
You bet, man. You're on. Likewise, if you're ever in DC, we're getting together. We'll do it up.
Good.
We'll do it up right. Okay. I'll say goodbye to you off the air, but before we sign off, folks, reminder, like I said, no podcast next week, but we'll be back in 2 weeks. Be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel, like the Facebook page, do all the things. Oh, my mom says she wants to see my scar. I don't want to get banned from YouTube, so we won't go there tonight.
I don't want to see your scar, Dave.
Yeah, I don't recommend it. All right, folks. Thanks for being here. Have a great night.